All right, welcome everyone. This week we're going to be doing something a little bit different, and I think outside the box, which is needed for this time when too many people have been led to believe that the box is all that exists for their mind and their creative potentials to reside in and adapt to, which is the cause of many of the problems that we're currently living through. So, getting out of that box and thinking about the broader space that actually exists within this universe and this realm of possibilities is very important in times of crisis, which have a lot less to do with the so-called geopolitical, material expression of things than the spiritual, mental space that has brought us in willfully to this situation that we've created for ourselves or allowed to be created for ourselves. Dave, being somebody who I've known for many years as a friend, a collaborator, and a poet, has distinguished himself in our age, which I don't think would be an extreme. It wouldn't be a leap for me to say we have a bit of a cultural dark age, if not a physical one yet, because Dave has not only worked at studying the minds of great classical compositions of the past and great composers, but has actually worked to hone a craft that a lot of people say is not something you should be able to do in the modern age, where poetry is something which is supposed to reflect the ugliness of the world around us and the absurdity of the world around us. And so to try to compose with a method that reflects at least the spark of that which animated people like Keats, Shelley, Schiller, and other greats is an absurd idea that we should have moved past a long time ago. Now, Dave doesn't believe that. Dave has produced a website over the years called The Chained Muse and a new magazine called The New Lyre, both of which will have links in the description box of this video. I highly suggest people check those things out for great essays as well as translations and compositions by himself and many other collaborators. Got some people in the waiting room here. Let me just get them in. Today, Dave is going to do a little bit of a riff with me and with the audience today, going through some of the content that I'm assuming some people had a chance to look at regarding some of the recent essays on the important matter of the spell and the techniques that have been used to cast a certain spell over the modern zeitgeist, of which we are all parts, that have been used for rather dishonest ends. And the solutions to these so-called spells aren't a lot more intuitive and elementary than you might realize. And I don't want to try to blow it out of proportion, but I'm going to let Dave just say a few opening remarks. I'm going to throw a few questions at him, and I'm thinking that the spark of dialogue is going to take a life of its own. So people have your questions ready. Throw them. I guess what we'll do today, rather than putting your name in the chat box, you can do that. But I would suggest there's a little way you can put your hand, a little icon for the hand, if you want to say a word or a question, and I'll call upon you in queue. If you don't see that, just put your name in the chat box. I'll keep my eyeballs on that, and we'll just go from there. So Dave, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. What a nice way to spend our Sundays as usual, right? It's nice that we have we have places to go. So this I was working on a series that I started working on a while ago, or it became a series. It started as I wrote a piece called Breaking the Spell, Mind Space, Trance Warfare, and Neurolinguistic Programming. And it was all at the height of, the recent madness that we've all been living through in some way. And of course, many people remarked that it almost seemed like people were under a spell, right? That they were hypnotized and they were sort of just in a flight forward, responding to all sorts of things. Behaving, there's almost a magic incantation-like quality to the messaging that we saw, the public messaging. And people just had this very new and radical story framed for themselves, and it really seemed like they had, a spell had been cast. So I started to look into that and discovered a lot of the work that the behavioral scientists and social engineers had been working on, basically to make it a science, right? Of how do you direct people without their without their awareness, without them needing to really think about it, I guess is what we've all seen, right? We've all seen these slogans that people just respond to without necessarily knowing why. Or I guess there's a quiet part, right? There's the slogans, and we all have this idea of like, yeah, this is the right thing. And I like the environmentalism narrative, right? Because at one level, we're told that there's a lot of science and there's going to be biblical sized floods and fires if we don't repent for our sins of the agricultural revolution and industrial progress. And, you know, but at the bottom, at the heart of it, there are just very simple images and felt thoughts that are, we just want green trees, green grass, clean air, right? We all want that. We're in these stuffy cities and life doesn't seem to be going so well. And, you know, maybe that's why, you know, people are like, that's why my life sucks. It's this whole industrial society and all that. All that to say that there are these images that people have. You know, Walter Lippmann talks about the images inside the heads of human beings. And that so we have different affectations towards these images. And we're not really thinking. They're automatic motivations, right? We've emoted with a certain image and it's felt to be true. And the quiet part is never discussed, right? What the details are actually are. And so Plato talked about this as in his Republic, he had the 6 different categories of souls. And the democratic souls were, you know, we hear democracy all the time. So I guess there are these slogans and these incantations that everybody seems to be possessed by and believe they're true, but we don't necessarily know why. We have a feeling that this is right. So a lot of it is automatic, it's unconscious. So I was just looking at, how do we do that? How is this happening? How are people put under a spell? And so that's where I've started to look into hypnosis and all these things and the idea of altered states. So we go through all sorts of altered states in a day from when we're walking, right? How many people think about every step that they're taking as they walk? They don't think about 99% of them, I assume. Sometimes we trip because we're not thinking about it, but generally speaking, we're not babies. We don't have to think about walking. That's a trance state, right? We're not really it's an automatic system that's doing it for us. If people get enraged, it's always an interesting one, right? It's like they press a button and suddenly they're just enraged and they're possessed. So there was this idea going back to ancient Greece of possession, right? And we have this throughout history, magic, rituals, voodoo rituals, or exorcisms, and people are possessed by bad spirits of some sort. They're also good spirits, we could say, right? We're inspired, right? It's some great idea has occurred to us and we feel compelled to pursue it, to write a poem or to express an idea. And so where does that all come from? What is the nature of all these different states? And what's interesting is that a lot of them we don't have to think about them, right? They seemingly come magically. They just appear and we all of a sudden feel different. And there are good ones and bad ones. So I think I would play we can listen to the Huxley quote, because this is a lecture that really got me onto this. And I think you'll find it fascinating what he says, and we can comment and just go from there. So we're talking about possession. It seems like people are under a spell or they're possessed. And it could be because they're angry, because they're happy. They've just been taken a hold of by something. And so, let's start there. What's going on? So this is from Huxley's What a Piece of Work Man Is lecture, which is very interesting. And it's timestamped. So let's just hear what he has to say.
And I shall begin by quoting a very interesting passage from the 19th book of the
Can people hear that okay?
Iliad, which describes the reconciliation of Agamemnon and Achilles. Agamemnon, if you remember, enraged Achilles by taking away his captive, Briseis. And finally, when it became necessary for Achilles to come back into the battle, Agamemnon made a handsome apology in public to Achilles and explained why he had done what he had done. And he says there, I was not to blame. It was Zeus and my bad luck and the fury that walks in the darkness that blinded my judgment that day when I confiscated Achilles' girl. What could I do? At these moments, there is a power that takes command. Ate, the eldest daughter of Zeus, who blinds us, accursed sprite that she is, flitting through men's heads, corrupting them, bringing down now one, now another. Why, even Zeus was blinded by her once, and he is known to stand above all men and all gods. Achilles accepts this explanation without any hesitation at all. It seems to him completely rational. And he says, how utterly a man can be blinded by Father Zeus. Now, who and what is Ate? In the Greek tragedies, the word stands for disaster. But in Homer, the word stands for the state of mind which brings on disaster, the state of blindness, the state of infatuation, the state of mind which leads us to do all kinds of absurd things against our own interest, things which make no sense to us whatever, and yet we still do them.
That's good, Matt.
Homer.
Yeah. So that was the excerpt that I found pretty interesting. As Huxley says, right, this is the old, not even classical Greek, right, pre-classical Greece. You have a bunch of gods, you have a bunch of different experiences and states that human beings can encounter in their daily lives in different situations. And, you know, you have the higher ones, you have the muses, let's say, right? The ideas, the poetic inspiration that we get, or the creative inspiration, usually the Greeks had names for these things, right? There were different kinds of muses that would come to us. And you have all sorts of different gods associated with different states, right? You have Dionysus, the god of wine and drama, spectacle. And so Ate, which he talks about, is like a fury that leads you to self-destruction. So Ate takes hold of you. And so, yeah, that was the beginning of of developing this series, was this idea that, so the social engineers like Huxley, the more clever ones, right? They observe that we go through all sorts of different emotional states, and there's an art there, that you can turn this into an art in terms of how do you induce the different states. So the quote, the one I use, the example is Aristotle in his Rhetoric, where he describes how would you induce pity. So it's the rhetoric. So it's all about how do clever politicians put audiences into a particular emotional state. And so he just gave the example of pity. And he says innocent people suffering injustices. So that made me think of, like we see today, right, in the media. How are we getting all amped up for these wars? It's the helpless women and children, right? It's the shelling of innocent people. And that's followed by slogans about democracy and freedom, things that we can all agree with, right? Which is the idea is there's a sequence. In hypnosis, there's this idea of sequence. So if you want to put somebody in a particular trance or state let's say that in a therapeutic setting to revisit some traumatic memory, right? You can get them to go back to a time where they felt a certain feeling, right? That maybe a lot of their life has been structured around avoiding those feelings, right? For years, for decades, for entire lifetimes. And so you can revisit these things. So Aristotle giving the example of pity is just one. How do you induce rage in an audience, right? How do you induce, what kind of images are most effective or for inducing rage or fear? It becomes really a science, right? Or a pseudoscience, I guess we should say. But the invariant is that we're feeling things, but what's the content, right? That the idea of the sequencing is you put people in that state, you get them to feel the things associated with a certain set of images. Then you get the platitudes, the general statements that everybody will agree with, that help build that air of agreement. So freedom, democracy, it's a war. Nobody should go hungry. Nobody should live in fear. And everybody's like, yeah. And then you get the new suggestions, right? We can't let this go on. We can't let Russia continue to destroy other nations, let's say. That's an induction right there for the average person. If they hear this and they're not erudite when it comes to all the geopolitical processes at play, you can feel the pain. You can feel that feeling of discomfort inside you. That's an altered state. That's a trance. And that's just politics. But what about culture? That's where the series goes, right? How does this happen with different forms of entertainment, different ways of putting people in where we seem to be able to magically alter our affect, like with pop music, right? How many people's lives they'll say something like, the music gets me through the day, right? And they're listening to like pop music, so that work and it sucks, but they have like this good pop music, and their state it changes very quickly. These are all examples of altered states, and we all experience them on a daily basis. So what happens when you try and just mimic or manipulate that, using the outward forms where you can model the different kinds of states, and then you just turn that into like a mathematical science, which is the irony, right? People like a lot of the art that people like, that they feel very strongly about it because they feel a certain way, especially with the pop music, or let's say anything from the recent decades. And if you question it or you try and make an aesthetic value judgment about it, we can get a lot of pushback, right? Not because we're trying to cast aspersions, but just questioning what is good culture, what is the purpose of culture. People can get very upset because their identities are attached to these things. But the ironic thing is that these are just formulas, right? These pop songs are really just formulas. They put you in that state of heightened affectation. They have lyrics that are catchy, and people don't think more about it, right? And they just go living from one state to the other. So yeah, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? So that was the first idea.
Yeah, no, Dave, I think that lays the groundwork very nicely. And I mean, the idea of creativity itself is sort of what you're touching upon in all of these questions of the altered states experience. And I think that it's sort of a fundamental yearning that we all have to go outside of our limits. Like we have certain norms, certain customs at every stage in our lives as individuals, but also as a people. And if we didn't have this as a fundamental elementary drive, I don't think we would ever have learned how to walk or talk. You know, we would have been complacent, just rolling around as babies without having experimented with something that was beyond our capacities, such that it required the creation of new ideas, new discoveries inside of our young minds and souls that would then give us these new powers of sovereignty, of moving ourselves. And I don't think as a species we would have gotten out of the caves had we not had that quality of leaping and making discoveries. But then there's a certain set of sentiments and emotions that are associated with those wonderful discoveries as well. When we leap outside of ourselves, there's a certain joy, a certain sense of again, sentiments that I think what you've been getting across in a lot of your recent essays in this series and what you've just said now is that this has been observed by oligarchical grand strategists, this need that we have to go beyond ourselves and to have certain feelings that also transform or at least affect our sense of identity, our state of being. But they'll try to create sort of the shell of it, the effect, and not and obscure the actual substance of what made it good. And so today a lot of people say, oh yeah, we have a lot of creativity. We have Netflix, we have video games, we have the movie and music industry. It's full of creative people. Google is a very creative zone for creative jobs. But then that doesn't exactly fit the bill for what you've been getting at, which is this higher quality of creativity. And I was hoping maybe you could say a little bit more something about how creativity has been, how has it been derailed in that sense, using some of the techniques of neuro-linguistic programming and the idea of some of these studies that people like Aldous Huxley have made of ancient Greeks, going back to ancient times in the present age.
Right. Well, what's interesting, right, I was thinking about for pop music, I decided to just revisit random, big songs that we've all heard on the radio. Even if we don't listen to this stuff, it's kind of hard to not have heard it. I know when I go to the gym, that's where I hear like whatever is the big thing, or if ever we're in a car. And there are certain ingredients for the pop songs, right? And you said it, Matt, when you talked about a desire for transcendence, to escape the ordinary, right? We all have a desire to escape just the daily grind and all that. But there are many ways to do that, or to transcend it, right? Or what's the difference between transcending the moments that we're in, or being present in the moments that we're in, as opposed to trying to escape them? Like popular themes are desire for transcendence, nostalgia, right? Those good old times, those careless, what was the song I heard last Friday night? Katy Perry, she got a bunch of them. Teenage Dream. It was just funny. It's interesting to look at them from this higher standpoint of what kind of states of affectation are being induced by these different kinds of pop songs. And that there is a certain skill in, like, it's interesting if we take the music away and just look at the lyrics, that's often a very interesting thing for some of these big pop songs. And then we start looking into who actually writes a lot of these #1 hits, which are pretty mysterious personalities. I haven't been able to find too much about them. There's one Swedish guy who's been, a lot of the Weekend songs that have like 1.2 billion views on YouTube, which how do you get that? Yeah, the lyrics are interesting, or Taylor Swift even, right? Like there was this song, I heard it somewhere and it just randomly occurred to me. I was like, what is this song? And it was a Taylor Swift song. And I'm sure, see, if I just say the lyrics, I bet you nobody will know it. But if I sing the chorus, everybody will know it. It says, she wears short skirts. She wears high heels. I wear sneakers. She's cheer captain. I'm on the bleachers. And then the other chorus comes back. She wears short skirts. I wear t-shirts. She's cheer captain. I'm on the bleachers. Now, nobody probably knows, right, just like that. But the song goes something like, She wears short skirts, I wear t-shirts. She's cheer captain, I'm on the bleachers. No, no, no. Everybody knows that. I'm sure you've heard that song. But I was thinking about it. Number one, it's interesting. There's a contrast, right? She wears short skirts, I wear t-shirts. She's cheer captain, I'm on the bleachers. Two different kinds of people. It's fun, sure. But then, so you get, basically they're just adding a bunch of repetitive tones, right? Rhymes that are catchy, and it'll put you in a certain state. And you can see if we start looking at more and more pop songs, there are these formulas that recur. And yet so much of people's identities and their lives are dependent on these formulas that seemingly magically alter their states. And we become dependent, and we're always looking for new ways to it becomes Huxley's Brave New World, right? Is the idea that it's a concentration camp with no tears, where people love their servitude. And there are just so many options for escaping reality. And when it comes, drugs is just one of them, right? Drugs is an altered state. You take a pill and magically your state is altered. Psychedelics, increasingly we become able to, people are creating their own realities, right? They're building their own realities around these different forms of magic that they now have access to. And that's been deemed the more effective form of slavery, where you give people the means to create their own realities, and the ruse is you're not changing actual reality, but you have all this power to alter your own personal reality that you've created. And that can very quickly become a prison.
Yeah, that's a very...
break out of that. How do we break out of that?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point. And it just sort of betrays the technique of how these false controlled oppositions and dualisms are used often to give us a false sense of freedom, when you're confronted with this idea that freedom is just this, or let's say adapting to some form of superficial or totalitarian structure of controls. You're told, okay, having the right behavior, that's freedom. Now, obviously that is suffocating. And so it is understood that for those who will feel suffocated by that expectation, which is what a lot of the baby boomers especially lived through from, in the 1960s, there's a very high value placed on adapting and being normal, being like the Joneses. So a lot of the younger people kind of knew intuitively that that was unnatural and wrong, but then they leaped out into this other idea, which was then created as a net for them. When you jump out of one net, there was another net created for them saying, no, your liberty is actually in making your own reality there, because there is no truth and no reality, which I loved about this choice you made to select a couple of excerpts from popular music. So a couple of very, very popular pieces from the 1960s that were very big in Woodstock in your latest article. One was Purple Haze by Hendrix,
right.
which featured the lyrics. And again, you don't often think about the lyrics to a lot of the songs we hum, but you'll think about the banality of the lyrics and the psychedelic nature of Purple Haze all in my brain. Lately, things don't seem the same, acting funny, but I don't know why. Excuse me while I kiss the sky. And I mean, we all kind of I have warm feelings towards that song.
Yeah, I know exactly what that is. I know where I am hearing that, right? We've all had moments where we, whether we're young, I remember my friends' parents, right? Or a lot of, I'm 32, right? So anybody that has had parents who grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, that's the music that they would listen to, right? That's what was on Shown 97.7 or whatever, 92.5. And so we all have memories attached to these moments.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that is something to do with also the anchoring idea that is prevalent in both hypnotic techniques and NLP that also you've been touching upon?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking what you also said, just the illusion of choice, right? Because that's a big thing in well, any kind of, I wouldn't even just say hypnosis, but any kind, right? The ultimate, the concentration camp with no tears is where it's known that if you try and force things on people, it doesn't really work, right? So any sort of like tyrannical form of governance, it can only go so far, the boots on the ground stuff, if you really want to get things done. If you go hard, you're ultimately going to get pushback. People just don't like to be told what to do, and it's not in their hearts, right? So if it's not in their hearts and minds and it's seen as something oppressive, you'll only be able to do that for so long. And I mean, it's taken history was trying to overturn these types of these more conservative, I guess, forms of dictatorship and tyranny versus the more liberal forms, which are much more the illusion of choice, right? Which is that you're seemingly, you have the choice of whatever kind of music, whatever kind of escape, video games, entertainment, porn, whatever it is, we have the choice is infinite. Have you consented to the government imposing mandates for what medicines people are supposed to take or what times they're allowed to walk on the street and all that? No. But the idea is there's some form of consent is necessary to, at one level, to get people to think that they're free. So people they can choose what drugs they want. Don't shame them for what kind of altered states and realities they want to create for themselves. Whether it's pretending to be somebody else, whether, where every day is like Halloween, increasingly, it becomes endless. So yeah, well, I guess that's the thing. It is endless, which is why it's powerful for people who don't have a sense of that deeper self, right? Which is where I guess where this is all going. And again, I the idea is for people, I'm sure people have thoughts on this, what does it mean to, I guess, yeah, that was the bigger question that arose. Once I saw that there were all these, once it became clear, because we all see this, but that there are all these different ways that people can constantly be just stuck in an eternal process of breaking in and out of illusions, right? From our work life, that's like the day job, that's one trance. Then they go home, they do whatever, they go into their Netflix trance, and then they go into their whatever other trance, their drug trance, their whatever it is. But and it's all magical, right? We don't have to do any work. I guess that's the takeaway there. We don't have to do any work for all these things. They're kind of we're just put in the moment and it's there. Even the work, right? We say work is, a lot of people don't like their jobs, but there's the thing, we don't pay you to think, right? In most cases, the way our society is organized with cybernetics and all that, the left hand doesn't really know much of what the right hand is doing. We have bureaucracies that sort of are these automated systems. Everybody just has their specific task that becomes very automatic for them, right? So anybody who's kind of used to their job, it's kind of automatic. You're kind of just used to it. So it's a trance as well. Mm. But then what about the deeper self? How do we get in touch with that? How do we develop that? Which it's clearly harder, right? Or it should take work to become like a whole person. And the one thing that I found very useful was the idea of an inner voice, and versus the idea of outer voices, right? Because we all have, there are narratives. This is another big thing in whether it's hypnosis or just psychology, our identities, we all have stories that we live by, and we have meta narratives, the meta stories that we live in as a civilization. We're in a capitalist society, and this is just how it works, right? Like, if somebody tells us something about capitalism, like, did they really think of that themselves? Where did they get this idea that, yeah, we're just a capitalist society and this is better than communism? We're free. We believe in free choice. And they're just spouting slogans, right? They're just no, the quiet part is never said, but they're just spouting all these things. So yeah, what about our own story? How do we discover our own real story, as opposed to just these ones that are imposed externally, right? They're the external voices, and they can't be avoided. We come up in a family structure, right? There's a structure. There's certain things that we're just going to do, right? This is the way we're raised, and everybody's got their own living situation. So those are all stories that we ultimately have. And I think if we press people on, where their stories come from, that's where it gets interesting, because, there's quickly like a silence, right? Or it gets very existential very quickly. Like, well, why this? Well, why that? Why not this instead? Or why are we doing things like this? Or why is our society going this way? Well, why doesn't it do this? People say, well, it's, people, what are the common ones we get? Well, it's because of greed. It's because of corruption. It's because of just more slogans, right? They're not really developed. So that's where I feel this idea of the deeper sense of self and inner voice that we can all tap into. And, like Huxley said, is curious phenomenon of human psychology. People do things all the time that's against their personal interest. We all have. That's a paradox, right? And so which kind of voice is telling us to do one thing, and what is the deeper voice that usually tells us it's not a good idea, or we should be doing this, but we're not, because whatever we have to do, we have XYZ obligation. And so there's just this tension, right? There are different kinds of voices. And I guess, yeah, the question is, do they have different qualities? Are there different kinds of, is there a hierarchy? And actually, just one fun story, because Huxley, in this lecture that we cited, he talks about how the Greeks had many different words for different parts of ourselves. Before there was the unitary soul idea, right? Like pre-Christian, pre-classical Greek, there wasn't really a unitary soul. We have our thumos, right? Which is our spiritedness, our vitality. We have the phranes, which is our sensual drives. We have all sorts of different spirits, gods, Dionysus, Athena, coming and inspiring us, the Muses. And so there are all these different elements. There are all these different voices, we could say. And so there was this guy that I was talking to at the gym who's into like the new kind of science stuff, the Sam Harris radical materialist stuff. They don't like the soul, right? There's no soul. There's no unitary. There's no one thing. There's no inner voice, because that's what I was asking about. Is like, well, what about, like, don't we all have an inner voice? What does your inner voice tell you about XYZ? And he says, I don't think there's one thing. It's a process of multiple things, of many things. And so that gets to what Homer was describing, that at different times you have the passions, you have the menos, which is the mind, right? And you have the psyche, which apparently only appears at like death. It's kind of, it's like we could say there. But yeah, the menos comes in. And for example, I mean, it's not all bad, right? The positive one, for example, the menos, and Huxley observes, like, even the horses in the Iliad, they can experience menos, right? They can get a surge of energy, right? Hercules, he experiences menos all the time. He slays the Hydra. He does all these things. And in more modern times, we have like, they associate this with psychedelics, flow states. You're super, and we've experienced this, right? If we're writing, you're super creative, you're in the zone, and there's a hyper focus. So there's a focus. And the menos, I found a fun quote that I think speaks to that in Schiller, when Schiller is talking about the sublime, and he's talking about Ulysses. So he's talking about the Odyssey. And when Ulysses is trapped on the island with the goddess, oh God, her name's going to escape me now.
Calypso?
Yeah. So Schiller says, beauty in the form of the goddess Calypso has enchanted the valiant son of Ulysses. And through the power of her charms, She holds him free. She holds him for a long time, imprisoned upon her island. For he believes he is paying homage to an immortal deity, since he lies only in the arms of voluptuousness. But a sublime impression seizes him suddenly in the form of Mentor, which is Athena. He remembers his better destiny, throws himself into the waves, and is free. So suddenly, a different kind of force or voice kicks in, right? Something inside stirs him. In this case, the name Athena is attributed to that. And the other one that Huxley just points out, I mean, this is just ancient Greek stuff, but like Socrates, who would talk about a kind of divine madness, or I think enthusiasm is another word that we can probably use. The daemons. What are the daemons? And some people will freak out when they hear this, right? Because, especially any kind of, let's say, if you have like a Christian Orthodox background. I was listening to some podcasters, and they're like, yeah, Socrates is talking about like the daemon that you're possessed, or for actors, right? They take on a certain persona. They embody a certain thing. So the daemons are these unnamed, right? They're not a known God, but they're a spirit that takes control of you, and all of a sudden you're creative. All of a sudden you get a poetical concept. So there were names for all these things, and they're still a thing. But that's where these idea of voices comes in. There's what's the difference between, what does our inner voice tell us, and what are these outer voices? Can we distinguish? Can we make the distinctions? And it's just interesting that in modern science, the radical materialist stuff today, it's actually taking us back to this pagan pre-classical times, where there are just, Huxley cites Russell, we're a bundle of perceptions. So there's not one unitary thing. There's not one soul or one identity. You have all these different forces warring inside you. And depending on what kind of person you are and how you learn to develop yourself, you're going to channel different parts of that. There's sometimes Ate may still jump in and try and ruin everything. So yeah, what are these different kinds of voices, and what does it mean to follow our inner voice? Which, some would call it we'll call it the light of God, right? Or the voice, or if you're Christian, the light of Christ, or there's many different names that can be given to that same deeper sense of the sacred spark in us, which is right. I guess that's where this is all going. What is the nature of that?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Oh, there's a little feedback there. Before I open up, I know a couple of people here have a few questions they'd like to throw out, or a few thoughts they'd like to share. Based on what you just said, I just wanted one last thing that came into my mind, which was that you cited in, I forget which one of your latest three essays, some remarks by Timothy Leary, who was recollecting the conversations that he had had with his mentor Aldous regarding the need to break society free, liberate society, especially speaking of the West, of its faith in Christianity, and replacing it with a new scientific, or is it a scientific paganism?
Yeah.
Was that? It was scientific paganism, eh? Yeah. And specifically this idea that you've just illustrated, that in the pre-Christian worlds, there was more of a multiplicity. There wasn't this sense of a unifying principle that would be something we could draw upon to find a sense of organizing our identity around a sense of the immortal soul, which is made in the image of a unifying creator. There was just an infinite multiplicity of causes of creation and of the causes of our own identities, which you can see sort of in the current age today, where there's promotion of like multiverses, both in like the statistical science world that we're being told is the only science of this world of probabilities, and that there's infinite possible dimensions, infinite possible universes. And you see it in films too, like the Avengers, a lot of Marvel, but almost everything in entertainment seems to amplify this concept of there's as many universes as there are things you could imagine. There's as many genders that you could possibly create in that sense too. There's no unifying one truth. So I was hoping maybe you could speak a little bit to the role of Timothy Leary, Aldous, and really what role they play, since they're often perceived in a very positive light as liberators by many people, especially amongst the baby boomer generation, who've lived through that and have maybe not thought about what it was that Timothy Leary and Aldous were actually doing as part of a higher intention or design.
Right. Well, it's actually, I mean, yeah, Huxley talks about the Dionysian rites, which he makes the point, right, that, you know, you could, one of the therapeutic ways of dealing with the different kinds of anxieties or suffering, there are different rituals that you could do, right? There are different activities that you could engage in. And so the Dionysian rites, dancing and music, was a way that you could transcend. Well, that's the word that we'll use that for lack of a better word. Or, well, you could escape. I mean, that's the right word. But they could be slaves, right? They could live their lives in misery for most of the week, but then they would get together in these kind of orgiastic, dance frenzied parties. And the word that comes up is catharsis, right? So it's a cathartic purge of a release of all those emotions. And I mean, look at modern pop culture. What is it, right? When people are like, I mean, there's literally trance music, but that's not the only one. But the trance scene, right? All the dance music scene, the club scene, what is it? So I think it's just interesting because a lot of these people, or a lot of modern people, let's say, these people is not it's not a good way to frame things, right? It's not, we're all in the image of God, right? We all have a creative spark. So we're not, there's no point of separating ourselves from other people. The interesting thing is, how do we connect that? How do we find that deeper self in each person? That's always interesting to imagine, because maybe they don't have it or they're not aware that it's there, but it is there. That's the idea of the soul. Like, it's not something that we choose. We all have a deeper self that we have to. Schiller talks about the ideal self, very similar terms. He uses metaphors of art, that like we all have this great work of art, which is our ideal self. And just like the sculptor who goes at the sculpture and has to try and remove every single imperfection until you just see this beautiful work of art, and all the straining and all the struggle that came before, you don't see any of it, right? What we see is the beautiful work of art. And it's as if all that came before, it's gone. It was never there. All we see is this ideal, and that we all have this ideal self. And so, I mean, that's a thought experiment that I do when I meet different kinds of people. Like, I wonder what the ideal self of this person is, you know, and then imagine a different world and what they're like, you know, in that world. Like, what are we all like in like a Renaissance situation versus like a Brave New World situation? Same person, but under completely different conditions. And what kind of identities do we take on in this different context? So yeah, like Dionysus, right? In this reference, it was Lucios, right? He was the liberator. And so there would be this catharsis, and this would be a way for people to escape. Of course, alcohol was the main ingredient for the altered state. But then there's the ritual, right? There's the dance, there's the spectacle. And we still have all these rituals, right? That's what I was getting at. People today who kind of reject any kind of spirituality or any kind of idea of the soul, they yet have very religious behaviors in the rituals that they engage in to alter their states, right? Drug addicts all have rituals. You know, if you're regularly there's different ways that they're trying to alter their states, but once it becomes their identity, there's all sorts of things they're going to do. Or it's even funny, slightly different, but the environmentalism stuff, right? For a lot of people who are quote unquote, atheist or whatnot, it's all about biblical floods and fires that are gonna destroy us if we don't repent for our dirty sins of industrial progress and all that. So it's all very religious and ritualistic, and there's a magic to all of it. And yet they've convinced themselves that their beliefs are more rational than if they had some idea that they have a deeper soul and self that's worth investigating and getting in touch with, rather than engaging in the kinds of things where we silence that inner voice in order to get by, right? In order to get through school, to get through work, to get through whatever it is we're trying to get through. And that becomes our identity, or lack of identity.
Well, definitely the sense that we all yearn to be authentic, that is something I think is pretty universal. And, I think that this is the knowledge of this, just like we have this elementary desire to go beyond ourselves, but we also have this desire to just be ourselves, to be authentic. And I think that a lot of the trappings that have been put for to capture a lot of the younger people who don't know how to think about the hypocrisy or how to adapt to this very sick world that they're expected to adapt to, they're given these missions that you can live for something bigger than yourself, like saving nature from industrial civilization. Every young person can be like Greta. And it gives you a sense of like something more than yourself, which is really what is fundamentally human, is to find that thing which is more than the limit of your birth and physical death, which you can tap into in the course of your life, and thus touch into something more immortal than again your little localized mini identity. But it's done in such a way that it's very perverse, because it's giving them a false sense of authenticity, which makes it even much more difficult to critically think about, well, what are these convictions? Who put them there if it wasn't internally generated from within themselves? Where did they come from? And it's difficult to again, self-analyze when it's tied to almost like a religious, even if they're an atheist, as you said, there's still a religious quality about this type of, like, people who are religiously atheistic, if they have it associated with a mission. So
Right.
that's tough.
And for the materialist stuff, the Sam Harris types, like, it's all about optimizing your machine. Your body is like a machine. So they're into meditation. They do all these things, but it's all mechanistic, and it gets really weird. Because, right, if you're denying that you have this deeper spark, which is immaterial, which ultimately that's what they get upset about. It's that there's something about you that's not quantitative, right? It's not just the neurons. It's not just that you have this amalgam, you're this bundle of different perceptions and your hereditary predispositions and your personality, which is the product of your of behavioral genetics, right? Which is now the big field with they have like polygenic scoring, so they're introducing this into Britain, like the NHS, and increasingly in all sorts of in the health system, where like we can predict academic performance at birth, right? Because we can identify the phenotypes and the statistical distributions of certain kinds of wiring. And so we know who's going to be good at school, and we have the data to show it, so that if people want to reproduce, and if people are having trouble reproducing, well, we can give them a choice. Do you want a stupid baby or do you want a smart baby, right? They're not going to force you. That's the whole idea of behavioral nudging and these illusions of choice. Do you want a retard baby, or do you want, not my words, but that's what they would say, right? Well, they wouldn't say it like that. They'd be nicer, but that's what they're implying, right? And that gets very tricky for people. But at another level, what was interesting in the Changing Images of Man document, which I used to do some of the recent series, they said that the hardest kind of change for people to experience that was noted in like therapeutic or clinical settings was a change of identity. So you could change your habits, right? Like therapists will often give people all sorts of different ways. You know, think about your day in like increments of 30 minutes or an hour, you know, if you're stressed out, you know, different ways to be present in the moment and not worry. But if a person has an identity that's killing them, or ideas that are self-destructive or lead them to not be able to tap into that deeper self because they don't even believe it's a thing, because it's not quantitative, it's not measurable, so it's not scientific, so therefore it's flaky and irrational, which is what a lot of people, that's where they're stuck. They can't let go of the fact that there's a part of them that's has no parts. And yet there's a science to developing that, precisely that thing. You know, LaRouche has a great book, The Science of the Human Soul. You know, what are the characteristics of that creative spark and how do we develop it? What are the kinds of culture that awaken it, right? And what are the kinds of practices that help us to cultivate that? Which is where I think meditation or prayer, right? This is where the idea of these higher forms of trance come in, where like we can know there's something there if we're the escape stuff, the altered states, it's easy, right? Whether it's entertainment, drugs, music, or whatnot, our states just seem to magically change. But what if we try to focus on our breathing for 20 minutes straight, where you're just thinking about your breathing, whether when you're walking or anything? It's actually really hard. But the question is, and I think a non-flaky idea of something like meditation is that, well, if we're assuming there's something already there, if there's a soul, then when we're getting into that place of deep awareness and quietness, is it really quiet? Like what comes up in ourselves, in our own inner voice, when we are in that kind of sacred silence with ourselves? Is it really empty? And I've noticed some people are afraid of that, right? Because so they're afraid of that inner voice because maybe it has problems with, you know, they're saying, hey man, like, what are you doing? You know, maybe that inner voice can kind of push back against the kind of situation that the person is living in. And so people will try to push that inner voice down, hence the addiction, right? Hence the affect regulation, the altered states. That's why, you know, drug addicts are so, it seems irrational. The behavior seems irrational, but it actually makes a lot of sense if we see what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to shut off a certain thing, avoid a certain thing. And so they're just looking for different ways to do that. But naturally, the magic always wears off. That magic wears off very quickly, and increasingly so. So then we have to find new kinds of magic, as opposed to the deeper getting in touch with ourselves and increasingly being that, you know, being at that place where we're always kind of present. And yeah, then it becomes interesting to talk to people because we see where they're at, or if they're there, or where are they?
Yeah, that's good. All right, we're going to shift gears. There's a few people who've been waiting with questions that have been burning. Blanca has been waiting for a long time. Blanca, go for it. Yeah, everyone is on mute, by the way, by default.
Yeah, thank you. Apologies for being behind the no camera. I just wonder about, Matthew, you mentioned the child, how the child is driven to grow and to acquire new capacities, like walking. I've learned working with children that the child is imitative, that the child imitates everything around them. And now the brain research shows how basically the child has theta and delta waves, which is a deep meditative state of being. And that's how the child basically downloads everything they encounter. And so for me, the question is how to go from that state in early childhood into an adult that is able to be conscious and working on being free. That would be something really to look into. And of course, the education comes to mind, to look at how we educated. You know, I grew up in a communistic regime in Czech Republic, and I'm able to actually hopefully see through lies and illusions a bit. And so it was not the education that destroyed me. So it's a little bit of everything. But the art in education, I would see as a supportive tool to become a creative thinker, perhaps. And with the genes, last comment is that with the research, the epigenetics now actually shows that the genes are really a tool. The genes respond to the environment and even to the thinking of that they're like a clay in hands of an artist. Well, who is the artist? That's the individuality. So that's ever involving. So thank you.
Thank you for that comment, question, Blanca. Dave, would you like to take that, say something to that?
Well, did you want to say something? You were the one talking.
You're the maestro today, Dave.
I have an idea. I mean,
yeah.
Actually, there's this idea of enchantment, right? I think what Blanca describes and what we've talked about, right? The awe and wonder of childhood. There's often, this is referred to, or it's been referred to as the idea of enchantment, right? We're enchanted by the world. Everything is magical. And rightly so, right? The child is kind of at awe with all the wonders and beauty of the world. And they're like in a hypnotic, like trance, right? Like we just receive impressions of the world. So we're supposed to receive smiling gazes, right? People that are happy to see us grow and want to give us the resources and all these things. And then we grow up, and oftentimes there's a disenchantment, which is the second stage, right? Because we awaken to the real world at a certain point, the quote unquote real world. We have all these responsibilities. We have things. We find out the world isn't perfect, and you know, it's not just smiling gazes greeting us all the time. There's actually a lot of ugly stuff, even evil, right? We have to come face to face with evil, right? I don't think we can stay in that state of enchantment and avoid and without facing that there is also an evil. That would be naive. It would be wrong to just want to stay in that childlike state and not look at the ugliness. So that's the disenchantment. I think we've all had to go through it, and it's necessary, right? But then there's also re-enchantment, which is, I think, which is the third stage, where how do we rediscover this wonder and awe, right? Where there is this creative spark, which in childhood, it's all very automatic. You know, the child's just like, why, and they just want to know, and they're just, you know, the whole world is like, it's like one giant, you know, you're a tourist in this new world with all these things that you've never seen. And so it's amazing. And how do we rediscover that there is actually a sort of magical creative spark in every human being, and that itself must necessarily be an intimation of something greater, right? It's in every person, but is that really, we all have that, but is that not only just a reflection of something higher that manifests itself uniquely in each person? And then I guess the real re-enchantment is, well, how do we go about bringing this out in more and more people? And that's where these questions of theology, religion, culture, you know, like what are the most conductive ways to developing that and warding off the imitations, all the perversions and fake ways that this natural desire in us can be perverted and led down the wrong path. And I mean, that's Dante's comedy too, right? It's, you first see hell, and he says, I found myself on I lost the straight path. Then he goes through this whole journey of having to get to paradise, going through purgatory, having to see hell and how ugly it can get before really having some idea of what paradise could be. I like to think of it that way. I think that's a fun way useful way.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Yuri, go for it.
Well, I've been drifting in and out of this conversation because I'm being distracted by so many things, telephone calls and the others. So I have missed some things. I made a comment, and there was a question in there, but it's not, I think it's probably been discussed. And I was talking about how when you're painting, I was a painter and I also am a woodworker, that when you're doing these things, you become, it produces an altered state. This happens in woodworking also when you're working on a lathe. You have a block of spinning wood, especially if you're not trying to recreate something to a design, or you're not doing it for a job, or you don't have to make copies of it. You're just sort of free floating with it. And the sensation is that you're not there anymore, that somebody else is controlling you. When you're working on a lathe and spinning wood, every slight emotion, every little nuance gets immediately reflected from the chisel into the wood, into the shape that you're creating. So that was just a comment. Is that the muse? Is that, I think that's probably the easiest way to generate bringing yourself out of having stuff programmed into you from the TV, especially. Music is a different thing. The lyrics can be poetry. So, the discussion on music is that, well, I don't know about contemporary music. I'm from the 60s and I still like the old 60s stuff, but there's a lot of poetry in there. And so, I think that can also take you out of become a muse. And as to the question whether a muse is keeping you from finding yourself, from finding your own inspiration, well, I think that cuts both ways. It could be a false muse, or it could be a good muse, I guess. It goes both ways. And then I had a comment about comparing journals with two old friends, and it's in the chat there. And this was about having to revise my personal narrative, my life narrative that I had told myself for years and years and years. This is what happened. Well, I came into contact with these two friends who kept journals as I did, and we compared times and dates. And this is a cross-continental from different continents. We compared different events, and this went on for about 2 weeks of an intense investigation. And so many things in my narrative were just flatly wrong. It was putting it all together. I had to totally revise my personal history. There's no question there. It's just a comment. So, well.
Thanks.
Yeah, there's a few good thoughts there. Dave, would you like to comment?
Well, it's a nice thought. And yeah, I think that's the humbling thing. We probably all need to revise our stories at some point. Who's got no, my story's just always been what it is, and that's what arguably that's the problem, right? People who think that way, like, yeah, that's my story, and end of story, right? Beginning, end of story. It's all, they're just so certain, right? There's a lack of humility.
Yeah.
I guess is what increasingly appears to me as weakness. And I think for a lot of people, though, it's still, there's that like kind of like classical macho or typical macho, like or like people who can't admit they're wrong. Like if you admit you're wrong, you're weak, means like you're stupid. A lot of people have that as a thing, right? Their perfectionism, that's a real thing. That screws a lot of people up. They can't admit that they're human and that they make mistakes. So how are you ever going to revise your story or your narrative or revisit it if you are a perfectionist who's kind of like stuck, like the neurotic type, right? Not perfection. We want perfect art, but like we to create a perfect work of art of ourselves, we probably, there is the work, there is the struggle. But yeah, the awe and wonder, I think, does come from discovering that real narrative, discovering our true selves, because then there's like a washing in of the truth, right? We're finally we're getting to know ourselves, which may have avoided us, escaped us for God knows how long, right? A lot of people tragically go to their graves not knowing, or it comes in the psyche right at the last moment. They do talk about this, right? That people on their deathbed become very honest all of a sudden. They have something wash over them. And I guess one thing that scared me is I don't want to be that. Like I don't want to go through that death, literally at death. And Socrates always talks about, like, that's what the philosopher's actually searching for. Ideally, we should be going through that death many times and before the real thing, so that we're actually getting to something more substantial. There is one fun quote, and I've criticized, me and my friend Adam on the chain Muse, we do a lot of polemics on art and aesthetics, and T.S. Eliot is somebody that we've often, I wouldn't say used as a punching bag. We wouldn't do that, but like aesthetically, there are a lot of grievances, or not grievances, but problems. But Eliot has this one, sometimes, writers, they'll have this very sober, there are very sober passages we find in art, even modern art or contemporary art. I've seen some movies or shows.
What I sent, Gary.
And they're kind of, they're not that great, but they have.
No, that isn't what I couldn't open. I could not.
I just would like to.
I can't right now.
Sorry, Yuri, can you hit mute, please?
Sorry.
I just wanted to, I would just read this quote. This is by T.S. Eliot. It's from his last of his 4 quartets, which he was inspired by having listened to a lot of Beethoven, which I think definitely helped. But he writes in the 4th of his quartets, so this is his most mature of works. He writes, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time."
That was T.S. Eliot who wrote that?
Yeah.
Huh. Interesting. No, that's I think key. And I mean, this question of our mortality and the reality of mortality is something very primal and very important to confront. And at first it's always scary, and it might like break, I'm sure babies and toddlers don't really have a sense that this journey is ever going to really end. But at a certain point, if you see it outside of yourself, grandma dies or whatever, and the idea all of a sudden of your own finiteness becomes a reality that then you can either confront as you mature with that reality, that there's something thus more transcendental to discover, tap into, and draw from, or run away from and escape out of, having to think about it out of fear, to the point that you end up, like Cynthia was telling me about the sad case of E. Howard Hunt, who played a key role both in the cover-up of the JFK murder, as well as some other nefarious stuff around Watergate. And he's a guy who on his deathbed had this complete crisis and just exploded with various truths that he'd been holding under his belly for his whole life. And then despite that, he discovered he wasn't actually going to die, and he took it all back, which is just super sad. But nobody wants to be that. Like you really, like you said, you want to be able to confront the reality of it. And like Plato or Socrates was saying through Socrates' voice in the Phaedo, the true philosopher is somebody who has learned to live a good life because they have been preparing for the reality of death. But in so doing, it's not that they've been preparing to die as the purpose of life, which is how the naive person interprets that dialogue, but rather it's that they've been falling more deeply in love and in tune with the higher truths that are eternal, that are beyond the world of becoming and finiteness that we physically live in. And that's just a most beautiful dialogue and discourse that I think a lot of these oligarchs have been afraid of themselves in their pursuit of immortality. Yeah, that seemed to have touched on something. Go for it.
That was actually one of the other thoughts that I had in my notes, because we talk so much about the people being brainwashed, or like everyday people, or the masses. But the irony is that the oligarchy is actually the most brainwashed of all, right? Like, if you want to talk about brainwashing, think of the rearing of children of oligarchical brood, right? That they're going through these mansions with all the portraits of all their ancestors. And one interesting thing that a podcaster, Jay Dyer, Orthodox Christian conspiracy, very interesting stuff. He just made the point, right? Why did the British elites send their kids to the boarding schools? And it's really to take them away from the mothers, because they need to train the empathy out of the children. If they're going to rule, there are certain parts of you that need to almost be like parts of your soul, you could say, right? This is where it's more like a spiritual sickness. It becomes hard to argue even as a philosophy or just like bad habits, right? But they have to sever themselves from certain parts of their selves, their inner voice and conscience that would tell them this is wrong. And that takes a lot of work, right? Like, it's rare to get an oligarch to flip, right? It's not like these people are converted all the time. The world would probably be very more interesting if that were the case. So there is a very strong brainwashing of the children, the almost like surgical removal of empathy and access to this creative spark, except if it's used to sort of maintain power. And so it goes really deep, and then you talk about like the sexual abuse stuff and the traditions that they have around the children, right? Like their own children too. It's not like it's just other people's children, because these are ways of sort of, you're getting people to split off into different kinds of people, and they're trying to create these people who are going to be societal managers, who are going to be able to do things that just normal human beings just would never do. So yeah, they're the most brainwashed, which is the irony. And they have to be, because otherwise how could you do, because you really have to think about it. It's not just like, it's not all automatic. There's got to be some conceptual work to run an oligarchical system. It's a very special kind of sickness.
Very well said. Adria, it is all yours.
First of all, I'd like to thank Matt and Dave. This has been so exciting for me, and I've enjoyed the other sessions I've attended, and getting to read your essays. I'm so far behind and I'm so ignorant. So
It'll come.
It'll come. Uh-oh.
Worst comes to worst.
Okay. All right. really looking
learned
forward to
it-
hearing what Adria has to say, but I think what we're going to do is go to another question and then give Adria a chance to fix her system.
Yeah, suggest she turn off her video, worst comes to worst, and speak. But yeah, we can go to.
Yeah, we'll make sure that she gets her question in. All right, so let us go to who's next up there. Hassan.
Thank you, Dave and Matt. So my question is returning to a couple of the things you said. One around enchantment, disenchantment, re-enchantment, and that, conversion is hard work, right? It doesn't happen every day. So I put forward the notion that the deeper the enchantment, the more profound a crisis one has to go through in order to break the trance. Is this always true? Are there other ways of looking at it? I'd love to hear your comment on this. Thank you.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I have all sorts of thoughts. I always like, we have our friend, I think I saw Kwan. I like to get his takes on these things too. I would say, if he wants to jump in, but I would, yeah, I mean, well, that's something I've thought about. You see some people that have very easy lives, or right, okay. We have this idea of the young folks today, they throw around the word normie, right? We've all heard that. I think like the normies are the people that think everything's okay and like, whatever it's important for the governments to make sure everybody gets the right medicine and XYZ. It's all for our safety. They're all normies, quote unquote. But there's different kinds of personalities, right? Schiller, in his naive and sentimental poetry, he identifies something that today we treat in a very narrow and ham-fisted way as the like conservative liberal paradigm. So what's the ethos of the conservative? It's very sort of practical, and Schiller talks about it as people who are very practical and they won't stray too far from certain established norms and ways that society functions, right? With the idea that we have certain traditions, right? There's an emphasis on tradition, and we should be cautious in questioning these traditions, right? So like the Catholic Church, it's like the oldest living institution. Who are you to question the Pope? He's got the keys. He's got Peter's keys and all that. And it can go both ways. There's the Garden of Eden, right? And eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and being cautioned against doing that, right? The caution being, if people start thinking that they can now judge what is good and wrong for themselves, right? And they give themselves that license to start doing what they deem is good for them. And often there's, a self-interest involved, right? There's a hubris. So the conservative ethos is to be humble and to respect authorities of certain kinds and to not stray too much from the norm. So naturally, and there's some virtue in that, it can also be perverted or usurped, right? Where you just listen to whatever the preacher says or whatever crusade the church has called for, or, you can't question the government. Who are you to, when JFK was killed, who are you you're questioning the government? What are you, a commie? That's also part of the same ethos, right? If you really just approach that from a formulaic and from a lower epistemological level, there's all sorts of perversions and tricks to that. But the idea that Schiller identifies, so these are the more practical conservative people. And you notice the more artsy creative types tend to be associated with the more liberal, right? And that's just statistically we can see, right? If we look at like whatever the actors or the artists, like they have more of a liberal bent often, not always. So they're more idealistic, Schiller would say. And there are these character types, right? We're just thinking in terms of, I don't believe in like fixed sets, but there are different personalities, different character types. I mean, that's what Shakespeare is looking at through drama, right? You have all these different kinds of characters. You have Hamlets, you have Falstaffs, you have Macbeths, you have witches, you have all sorts of different things. These are real characters. And to the degree we're naive about that, we may get we're naive, and that can lead to all sorts of bad things. So the liberal types, though, because they believe they have more of a freedom of imagination and exploration, right? They tend to tap into their imaginations more, new ideas, new creative ways of doing things. Conservative tendency is more towards, this is the way it's done. Who are you to think you can challenge this? And if it gets really radically orthodox, they didn't have toothbrushes 2,000 years ago. Why, in the Bible, do we need toothbrushes? If you're really, but you can see it can go all ways. And Schiller makes the point, though, so the conservative personality will rarely stray too far from the established norms. The idealist, the more liberal disposition, if they stray and they fall into an abyss of some sort, the fall is bottomless. The idealist who finds himself in reality, the real world, having had all these high ideals, the fall for the idealist is infinite, it's endless, right? There's no limit to what they'll do, because the world that they believe in and the world they inhabit are incommensurable. So it's like, hey, we're not in paradise, right? Or for the fundamentalist religious type, same thing, right? This is earth, this is the fallen world, so we're all sinners, right? Heaven is infinitely far. The kingdom of heaven is infinitely far. So there's no point in trying to be, well, ironically, they're kind of, there's no point in trying to imitate Christ, let's say, if they're Christian, because that's impossible, right? That's infinitely far from fallen human nature. So you get this Manichaean paradox. So I think depending on the kind of person, this enchantment idea, you can stray far if you get disenchanted, versus you just fall into the mold and you just do what everybody else is doing because this is what like regular working people do, quote unquote. You become, or you rebel big time, right? The adolescent romanticism, right? Which if we fast forward, first it's all nature and love and all that, or just like the hippie stuff, right? Peace and love, enchantment with nature, but fast forward, and what does it become? Well, it's either the pendulum swing to the strict Apollonian sort of establishment types, right? The hippies that become like these politicians and whatnot, and like they're all formal or CEOs or business people. Like one self dies, but another, like it's just extremes. So yeah, I think everybody's different. That's the interesting part. Like everybody has a unique self. So how people deal with that struggle and journey of their soul, or if they're lost on that journey of the soul, like, I mean, that's where the possibilities are infinite, right? The variations, the deviations, there's no shortage of what could be. So yeah, that's what I'd say. So I would partially agree. Then there's people who've gone through really bad things and they're more sober, but they've also discovered that deeper self because they had these false selves and they got rid of those, right? They discovered their narratives were wrong because they couldn't continue with the narrative that they had or felt they couldn't. And so they actually go to that deeper level. But then I think in a healthy society, transition should be somewhat smoother, right? Like we're supposed to cultivate with great art, with great culture, such that children, right, they are in choruses, they are learning arts, they are learning to play instruments, they are learning to write, they are exposed to great storytelling, right? Their imaginations are cultivated. They're not being trained just through reward and punishment, to get the good answer on the test in order to pass, or to be failed if they get the bad answer. There's more of a creative development across the whole journey. Challenging questions, right? How do we bring all that together and formalize it to some extent, right? You need some formalization, but not so much that it becomes this dead formula where people are just throwing around slogans right? Or whatever they believe, their beliefs, but then they're not really doing the work, right? They're not.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess part of that feedback, weird. Part of that thought, like you said, and you've been alluding to, does touch most importantly upon a certain quality of the arts, which have been in some cases obscured, derailed, but many of those born past, I'd say World War II, have been increasingly cut off of the source that animated people like Schiller in his creative compositions. And I was thinking about the quote by Bobby Kennedy when Martin Luther King had died. Because you're like, well, what animated the type of identity formation which such individuals who were exceptional had been able to tap into? And Bobby Kennedy was had confronted his own mortality too, and he quoted Aeschylus when MLK was assassinated. And he was, he had very little, I don't think he had any bodyguards. He was in front of like a mob that was ready to turn violent in riot. And he noted that in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair against our will comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. And I don't think that the pain and the despair is necessarily needed personally. And I for wisdom to take root, in the sense that I don't think we need to necessarily go into the bottom and the depths of hell in order necessarily to come out into paradise, in a physical state where our lives are necessarily threatened or something like that. But there is something which art does allow us to tap into, whereby, wisdom, it does seem to be the effect of that type of honest immersion in that type of art, which certainly nurtured the soul of people like Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, that you see with people like Aeschylus and Schiller. That being said, I'd be curious what Kwan was the next on the list to say a word, and based on this fruitful question that Hassan threw out, I'd like to see what Kwan has to say about this as well.
Yeah, well, that's what is called synchronicity, because my comment was on the question before Hassan asked the question. So first, I want to say that I read your last two articles and they are truly outstanding. And I would like to say that you made, in my understanding, the perfect focus on what is truly essential, meaning the eternal opposition between rhetoric and dialectic, okay? And I don't remember on which of your two articles, but you wrote that rhetoric is precisely to focus on what is superficial and to bring that superficiality as something to be nurtured. And dialectic, on the contrary, is not ignorant of the superficie, of the surface stuff, but would go deeper to dialecticon precisely, okay? Because let's not forget that when we said that when you have enchantment, disenchantment, and re-enchantment, precisely that sequence, let's not forget that dialecticon means playful exploration, okay? So if you have in your heart and in your mind that fundamental attitude of an aristocratic man, meaning playful exploration, you go into enchantment or disenchantment with that same core attitude, which is your true energy. Because if you are speaking of enchantment or disenchantment, it's the others that would be the creator, if you want, or the producers, okay? Because once again, I want to oppose producers and creator, the producers of your enchantment or the disenchantment. But if you truly went through your personal epistemological journey, or to speak religiously, the journey of your soul, it's not the sense of perception or the productions of others, and those productions can be of high quality. Okay, I'm not saying necessarily that it's something of bad quality,
those things could be of high quality, but you're only there to receive. You're not a creator. And once again, I go back to Plato, okay? And as you wrote in one of your two outstanding articles, in book 10 of the Republic, Plato stressed the fact that if we need to kick out poets or not, okay? And that was a dialectical question, okay? It was not a prescription from Plato, okay? Because it asks again the question, what kind of poet? Do you have the kavi or the rishi, okay, to use a Sanskrit word, okay? The kavi is the ordinary poet, the rhymers, and the rishi is precisely the one would use the superficie to bring you to the aristocratic attitude, meaning dialecticon, playful exploration. And you gave the excellent example once again in one of your two articles, I don't remember which one, The Tempest by Shakespeare and The Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, okay? So the background is the same, okay? We are lost in the new world. What do we do with that new world, okay? But the answer by Shakespeare is dialectical and aristocratic, and the answer by Aldous Huxley is plutocratic and not aristocratic at all. And I would like to say from my own experience, when I was a teenager, I read the sci-fi novel by Frank Herbert, Dune, okay? And it is extraordinary. I love that novel, but I had enough classical education in me at the time to know that it's garbage, but it's high quality garbage. And that's the stuff that you need to introduce in the mind of the children and of the teenage. There's nothing wrong to go across garbage. Okay, imagine that you have a promenade through Montreal. You might bump into some garbage, and it's okay. You just avoid that garbage. Okay, so it's the same for the journey of your mind, of your soul. But you need that classical education during your childhood. So when you are in teenage, the age of exploration, you can have a playful attitude or an aristocratic attitude with garbage or with high quality production. Because let's not forget that even if it's high quality production, if it's not your creation, it's not really useful. Okay, it's better for you to be creating something smaller, but it's from you, rather than to be a robot, even a robot inspired by Plato, okay? Because you can be a robot inspired by Plato if you did not truly understand Plato. And I have plenty of other examples, but I will shut up now because it would be too long.
That's great. I mean, that was yeah, lots of thoughts are coming. I really appreciate. There's a lot. Yeah, you said a lot, Kwan. I appreciate it. I was thinking, just to go back to what Matt said into time, because he talked about how we don't need to experience all the tragedy in real life. I feel like that's a great paradox, right? Like we really need to go through that for the disenchantment that we're talking about. Does it really have to be like all really bad things? Do people have to go through traumatic experiences to, get to the other side, shall we say? Or is there a more playful way to approach it, right? And Schiller talks about this, right? The play instinct. I mean, he dedicates a lot of his work to that. And I think that's the point of art. It is to play out these scenarios on the stage of the imagination, right? Rather than to enact these tragedies in real life. And I mean, that's Dante as well. What is the Divine Comedy? He shows us hell. He shows us how ugly and dark it can be to inspire a healthy kind of disgust, I'd say, to know that like can get this bad. And I feel like, because now we're seeing it in real life, like we're seeing, like when we see these Skid Row style hellscape cities across America, it's like, whoa, this is way too real. And so then, you know, what Dante is talking about in the Inferno, it's becoming increasingly real. But I think the point of great art, the dramatic stage, is to play these things out in the imagination so that we don't have to actually live through it all to gain the wisdom of these things, number one. That's why we have poets. That's why poets were called seers, or, you know, had prophetic qualities to their work, right? They could forecast what's going to happen under certain circumstances by understanding the psychologies and the persona that we're dealing with on the stage, so that we become wise to all the different elements that we can encounter in the real world. And so, yeah, I mean, being able to play these things out in our minds and having, which is what the classical education in a sense will give us, the ability to acquaint ourselves with all these things, is the thing that is, it's a backstop, number one, from, I like what you once said, Kwan, once you were saying, like, a line of wisdom would be, don't do anything stupid. And I forget, but that's actually a really good one, right? Because nobody's perfect, but don't do anything stupid. And, you know, the great dramatist will show you what stupid really looks like and how bad, you know, stupid can get if you're, you know, committed to a stupid idea or to being stupid. The classical education is really important to inoculate people against that. And the one technique that I found useful, which is not, you know, they talk about it in NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, but it's a thing that we see in art all the time. It's a visualization, right? So they even say, let's say for recovering alcoholics or people that don't want to drink anymore, they can play out the scenario of what happens if they decide to have a drink, right? Like, do you really want it? You know, remember what happened last time? Play it out, press pause on where you are in the moment and play it out. Because oftentimes we're not actually playing it out in our mind with a visual where you can feel all those things that you're actually going to feel, which you don't feel because now you're in one altered state. And then you're going to alter that state and it's going to feel okay, like magic, but then you're going to be on the other side. And so why not play that all out and see where you're actually going to end up? And I was just thinking about how great art does the same thing, right? Anytime you're asking somebody to imagine, you know, themselves in a scenario and you walk them through that, it's a very powerful idea. It's a very powerful tool. And we can all play ourselves out in different scenarios and see what wisdom comes of it. You know, play it out. That's the whole point of having a good imagination. You don't have to wait for everything to happen. I mean, that insight, it's a word, right? It's like, we didn't make it up. The word insight is, we have the ability to foresee and anticipate things before they happen. Otherwise, we'd be just beasts, right? If we don't have access to this quality of wisdom. Yeah, I like that art really has this.
Dave, with your permission, and I would like to read 10 lines of your article, because that, I think, is the message, okay? When properly considered, one begins to get a clearer picture of why Plato so emphatically stressed the role of art, culture, and poetry in a genuinely sovereign republic, including whether said art could lead people to the real thing or simply artful imitations. Ultimately, Plato surmised that the survival of any republic depended on whether individuals could distinguish the real thing from imitations of the real thing. Okay, I think all our discussion, or everything we discuss in this group, revolve around those 10 lines.
Right. And that's why they say everything philosophy after Plato in their footnotes, right? Like, I mean, this was...
Absolutely. And by a questionable guy, white hat, but you know, questionable guy sometimes say great things.
Absolutely. Yes, the garbage one, I like that example. It's all that you said though. Right?
Yeah.
You can like, there's garbage, right? We know there's some of these pop songs, like they're fun, right? Like you can see or different kinds of things, but as long as you know, like it's high quality garbage. You want people to be able to make those distinctions, because we don't want to force people, right? It's not dog training, right? We're not trying to train dogs. Don't do this, do this. That's not how you create good people. But we do want to instill a desire and sense of that higher good that's in them, and see how this high quality garbage, while dazzling and appealing in many different ways, like, is it really food for this, is it really feeding you, your soul or body, right? Depending on what kind of garbage, or, what is the nature of it?
Well, I find that there's this difficulty that many people encounter in seeing like, we're living in a world where you don't tend to have either evil or good in pure states. It doesn't really seem to be like there's no model of like absolute human perfection that we ever encounter in such a way that a human being can't be made better or is devoid of some problems or even evil. And Plato gets at this point in his dialogues in a nice way. People often forget that even those doing evil are themselves victim to a variety of things that make them ignorant of certain realities of their own, what their own health, the health of their own soul yearns and craves for. Because of their ignorance that has to do with both intellectual as well as emotional, spiritual factors, they rationalize or twist logic in such a way that they conclude that what they're doing is the best possible thing for them or whatever. But there's like some bastardization or illusion of the good, which replaces the real thing, causing a whole monstrous set of consequences to happen. But when you just cloister yourself too much and just try to naively only surround yourself only with supposed pristine perfection, well, first of all, it's an illusion, because there is no such thing as pristine perfection. But you then create a high degree of naivete of what is reality, what is the good that is found within things, that is thus made perverse, that would give you insight and wisdom to see beyond the surface of things. And I was thinking, just for the one example of like Buddha, the story of Buddha, he was, as far as I understand it, a noble who was born into a very cloistered environment for much of his childhood and youthful years in a Hindu sort of environment, but it had become very encrusted and crystallized in, a formal structure of behaviorism that was devoid of the essence and love of goodness. And it was only when he got out of the walls of his little cloistered environment that he saw the injustices of the world, that something awoke within him that wanted to remedy that. He asked the priest, and he asked a variety of holy men who were supposedly wise, how could such a thing happen? Such poverty and such pain. And he wasn't getting any satisfying answers. There's obviously very similar stories with the story of Christ as well, right? From a certain, and if these people had just remained cloistered in the conservative, traditional environment that they were expected to adapt to, then could you have had something better created by their leadership? And I don't think that would have been the case at all. But it's got this balance. They were tapping into this balance of like what you were talking about, Dave, of the need to have that. I don't want to say the word liberal because it's been so bastardized, but that flexible, creative leaping out of norms, while at the same time obeying certain principles that are still true, if custom finds itself to be broken or rotten of its spirit, right? Of the spirit of love. So it's an interesting, balance to always keep in mind. Like, how do you have both the best, the best qualities of change and no change, of like the no change of truth, of the eternal, transcendental quality of this higher domain of reality that we all yearn for, but we can never fully achieve 100%. We can always just sort of be inspired by and have it guide our conscience and our choices, while at the same time having that appreciation for the need for revolutionary changes in ourselves and in our society that are tied to something that is principled, not arbitrary or not chaotic in a sense that we've all seen destroy the good far too many times.
Yeah.
That was just a thought that came out.
I just want to jump in for 10 seconds, okay?
Yeah.
Just considering what you said, Matt, sometimes so-called modern artists when think that they are very revolutionary, for example, by exposing pieces of meat that will rot after 2 or 3 days. But that is pure hubris, because they think they are very revolutionary, but after all, the meat will rot because of natural laws. Okay, so they always under the order of natural laws. So there's nothing revolutionary in it. Right.
Good point.
Right. And the question that comes to my mind, because I feel like I've heard, the aesthetic arguments, right? That's a lot of it started with aesthetics, right? Like if we think about where our modern Brave New World culture came from, I mean, it really did start with the modernism and the change in taste, right? In aesthetical taste, or what taste really was. Was there such a thing as good taste? Was there such thing as objective beauty? Like now it's in the laws, right? Now it's spilling over into the domain of law, medicine, but it started in the imagination. It started in the aesthetical world and what our idea of beauty is. And then that spilled over into the philosophical, right? And the metaphysical. And then downstream, right? Politics is downstream from culture. It trickles into the political sphere and finally the legal. So it's no small question, but it's just this, people get it twisted when they're thinking about how it actually works, right? They're thinking like, oh, people are saying they saw somebody shoot somebody in a movie and that's why they killed somebody in real life. Like it's just this one-to-one relationship, but it's more subtle. It's the imagination, and it's those immaterial things and how they're influencing our perceptions. And yeah, I ultimately, where did we get our ideas from? Right? Like Quan, what you say about the person who thinks that's art, they didn't actually come up with that, right? Like they have an idea of what art is, and they didn't come up with it. They got it from somewhere. So I guess the question becomes, do we really know where ideas are coming from? Should we not know, when we start to think there are ideas, isn't this what Socrates talks about, Matt, with the wind egg, right? We have these ideas, these beliefs that we think are ours, and our identity is tied to them, but they're not even ours, actually. And I think there's a humility to that, good or bad ideas. There's very few minds that actually come up with completely new ideas. So we are all part of some kind of tradition, some eternal dialogue and process of development. I guess the question is, are we aware and conscious enough to know where we are in that dialogue, that process, and what the nature of it really is? Or are we hubristic and thinking like, yeah, I thought this all up, capitalism, and this is just the way society works, and that's a normie, right? They have tons of ideas and metaphysics, but if you would talk about any of it, they'd act like they wouldn't, they think it's weird.
It's blind unexamined assumptions that are animating their conclusions, and thus they can't really have been said to be the cause of their own convictions if their convictions have as foundation blind unexamined assumptions that were put there by other people that weren't them. Because conventional wisdom says we should all believe this, and then you build a whole system on that. But that being said, there's a few more questions in queue. maybe about 5. Dave, do you have any hard stop in your time here? Are you okay?
We're good for another half hour.
Okay. Yeah, strange little. Are other people seeing static here or getting static, or is it just me? Yeah, okay, it's not just me. Okay, that's weird. That's okay. I'm sure it'll resolve itself. All right, so Kirsten has been 7 hours in the future. It's very late, so I'm gonna just put Kirsten a little bit higher up in this ladder of weight. Kirsten, go for it. What's your thought question?
Thanks. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. What really touched me was when you talked about this meeting people and trying to meeting people with the question, who is you as your higher being? And this is something I worked 10 years with handicapped people. I don't know if that is the right word in English, but like autists and people like that. And I experienced that this is not just something you do in your head. It's not just an idea. When you try to meet people with that, with that mood, that it works. You can in my work I experienced that that my day with these people was completely different, and the way they were reacting was completely different than if I didn't have the spiritual force to have that mood toward them. And then I started to study the subject a little bit, and in Germany there has been I'm sorry if my voice is a bit weird. It makes me nervous to speak in front of people. But then there was this experiment in Germany where they had some brilliant children who were going to do tests on subjects where it was clear that they have no problems to doing these tests. And without the children knowing and without the teachers knowing, the teachers who was going to test them was one time told that this child was a brilliant child, and the child went into the room and did the test, and the test was brilliant. And then the next teachers were told that this child is a stupid child who probably won't be able to do the test. And it was the same test. And the child went into the room, and they had also a part of the experiment was with things, electroden, like
electrodes
brain
on their
They were picking up the brain waves.
Mm-hmm.
And the moment where this child entered the room, they could see the brain waves changing in a negative way, and the child failed the test. And they did this a few times, so that it really showed that it has a big impact how you think of people, think about people. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Dave, do you have a thought about that inspires?
I was thinking you've often.
Ooh, Dave, something just went awry with your microphone. It's been great up until 5 minutes ago.
All I think was unmuted.
No, when you click on the microphone icon, the little arrow, do you have an option or options of various microphones on your computer that you could select something other than whatever it is now?
Is this better?
No static. Yeah. Say count to 5.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
There's no static. Let's just say that. So yes, it is better. Yeah.
Okay, I think it's same. Anyways,
It's good. It's good. Go for it.
Well, you often talk about I've heard you use the Pygmalion example, right? Where if there are assumptions, right? That's like My Fair Lady, where he teaches her to be all these things, and he finally falls in love with this genteel or like aristocratic woman that was taken from like a poor, whatever milieu. So he kind of falls in love with like what he's created, but it goes in many different ways, right? Your assumptions about people. I don't know about like when we're talking about the brain waves. I mean, I think I get it, but I'm assuming that it's just the body language of the teachers in relation to the kids. If everything else was the same, which I can see can affect children, right? But there's so many things. That's one subtle or minor example of just how or seemingly minor things can sort of, you're sending messages to people. There's a lot of the behavioral science stuff is that, right? The brainwashing, it's like the cues. I like to think, because this is a big one, monarchy, right? And royalty. What's one of the big psychological tricks that they have? It's the spectacle, of the royal, the fairy tale like quality of it all. And that creates a distance between you and this so-called aristocratic class. So there's a message there that you're different. We're not the same. And that's how a lot of power is exerted. I like Kwan's example. He talked about like the walls of Babylon, right? These like towering walls. And there's just these big ancient towers, and how people perceive that, right? Like if we fast forward today, that's what a lot of the nudging, the behavioral science, it's just little things that, experts say, leveraging our perception of authority, which is a mental shortcut, right? We go to the doctor and listen to what the doctor's saying, because the doctor has gone through all these years of education, XYZ. So from a survival and just automatic standpoint, we're making a choice. We have the choice of following our ignorant knowledge of a thing or listening to an expert. All that to say, it's just a slight nudge, just by saying it's an expert and the brain can will make an automatic choice just by weighing the possibilities. And so this stuff is endless when we think of all the little things that shape people's perception of themselves, just by, don't touch the queen. We don't touch we shouldn't, don't touch anybody without their permission. Wrong. But the idea, right, that'll be like a thing in the news. If I remember Michelle Obama, she hugged the queen as like a big deal, because you don't, she has her gloves and she shakes your hand, but you don't touch her. So these are they're nudges, right? But they're throughout history, the spectacle, people are even longing for that now. It's the mystique. That's another thing, mystery. People love mystery. There's something inside us that wants the unknown, that has a longing to kind of know something beyond just our immediate perception. So there's like cults and secret knowledge and royal spectacles. These are all different forms of magic, you could say, right? That kind of change the way people magically perceive things.
Right. Yeah, there's that issue that you were touching on at the beginning of the felt thoughts, getting people to become prey to felt thoughts, which, have a virtue, like you made the point of insight. Insight is not, it's something that goes beyond pure logic. You have, it's more than the pure technical aspect of knowledge of a thing. So Bach was able to, with his deep understanding of harmonies and everything that he gruelingly worked towards developing a technical specialization for, with that, he was able to then improvise and play in ways that a lot of people thought was just this weird, mystical thing they couldn't understand or identify with, and it became almost perceived as being more than human. But it's like but it was rooted in something, or what Yuri was saying about, sometimes you're conducting your craft, your art, your painting, and it's like something higher than your logic is animating you, which is touching some higher sentiments, and you can't put it into words. But it couldn't happen had you not developed a deep familiarity with your craft. If you skipped the step and just tried to start like splattering paint, like I was taught to do in fine arts, on a wall, and then, being rewarded by my teacher for having like such great random, tapping into some, I don't know, basically we were taught to be fakers. Then you wouldn't really be able to access that thing that Bach or Yuri were talking about, or what you've been alluding to. And so I think, this idea of the unspoken or the felt thought is something which, as a child, like children are very in tune with this. And if adults around them say the same things, like two kids walk into the same, like two different rooms, and they're told logically the same words by the adults, but if the adults have two different attitudes in how they communicate those same words, the kids will pick up on those deeper, subtle sentiments, the spirit, and they will then either they'll trip and fail, or they will succeed according to the tone. It's like how you say something is often just as important, if not more important, than what you're saying individually, which is a truth that I think was also used in a dishonest way by these neurolinguistic programmers over the years, who use these techniques for their advantage, to hypnotize, but not to make you better, to make you more malleable in a sense.
Yeah, an interesting one is the like people that they talk to you like you're a baby almost, with a very soft voice.
TED Talks.
So, yes. So what we're going to talk about today, or in management, I actually noticed this, and I've told other people, and they notice the same thing. Like management in big organizations, they get training, right? It's not like they fully understand what they're doing, but the soft tone, like, would it be okay if, would you be able to work on Saturday? I know that it's usually off, but the tone changes because they're accessing that nice, warm, kind of motherly feeling, right? So like, because they did a lot of studies of like the artificial family systems, like group therapy. And I believe that's what Brigadier John Rawlings Rees, that was one of the things he did when he talked to people. He used that motherly sort of, so what we're going to do, right? Speak slowly, and you kind of let the gaps between your words, that creates a gap in the mind so that people's imaginations are filling in the gaps, which gives the appearance that they're coming to the conclusions because you're speaking slowly. And so what we're going to do, and if people aren't aware, it works on people, right? It works on we all have that soft spot, if we've had mothers and we've had that experience, like so it's easy to tap into that. That's just like one insight. But then again, when you're a sociopathic social engineer and you turn this thing into whole science, they just have a bunch of tricks. But then it's like, if you're onto it, it's a bunch of tricks. It's really not impressive, and it kind of gets dark, because really you're putting that much effort into the fake thing, into imitations. Why don't you just try the real thing? Why don't you try and actually learn how to develop people, instead of finding new ways to frame things to create the right positive or negative affectation towards this image or that image, right? Green trees, green grass, clean air. We all want that. Garbage and technology, that's dirty. And so we're nudging people. That's what the behaviorists are all about. Let's not explain anything to anybody, but then there's always a quiet part, but then there's the surface structure of the message, the slogan, that is what people have an affectation towards, and either negative, they go away from it, or positive, they go towards it. And the deep structures, as they say in NLP, like the quiet part, you don't talk about that. So people they start to seem schizo, because they're for let's say, or well, we don't want to get too political. They're for like abortion rights, but then they're for mandating, you know, government interventions on medical interventions on everybody. How can you be for the integrity of bodily autonomy if you support, you know, the forced injections of everybody? But yet there's this felt thought at the top, which is what they're responding to, and the quiet part, people just don't. It's not discussed, and we're just running society based on that.
Right. Audrey, I've noticed that you made it back. Are you able to?
That was like the most inauspicious debut ever. You know, I'm so embarrassed. It's unbelievable. I don't know what happened, but I'll try to get my comments in as quickly as I can. I'm so enthusiastic about this conversation, so thanks for the opportunity to comment. There are two things that come up in my mind immediately, and it's both going back to the 1920s. One is surrealism and one is the Bauhaus. With surrealism, you have André Breton, who obviously has this history with World War I and working with psychiatric units and, you know, shell shock, traumatized people, out of which he cultivates the art and aesthetic of Freudo-Marxism. It's synthesizing Bolshevism and Freudian theory. And this is the guiding ethos of surrealism, the influence of which is so felt today in the art world. In fact, the contemporary art fair that was held in Venice this summer, organized by an Italian curator, had Rosie Braidotti write the catalog. This is a transhumanist who studied under Deleuze, and the entire theme of the Biennale was on transhumanism, and it featured very prominent surrealist women who believed in casting magic spells. They believed that in magic, and they advocated in their life casting spells and things. One of whom is Leonora Carrington, who was associated with the a lot of people in England. You know, she was British. She was but in any event, she wound up in an insane asylum and had shock treatments and things, you know. So but this was a big focus of the Biennale, is this kind of legacy of surrealism and magic and casting spells. The precursor of this is not even Baudelaire. It's, I think, Antonin Artaud, who created this idea of the theater of the absurd, out of which, and he also was in an insane asylum and also cast spells and literally wrote the spells, like wrote people letters like, I've cast a spell on you. And he was an artist as well, as being an actor. But in any event, the legacy of Artaud is very strongly felt in the pop music scene today, because he informed upon people like John Cage and Alan Capro, who theorized Fluxus, and this is John Lennon, this is Yoko Ono, this is, you know, the 60s. This is the New York Dolls. This is what Andy Warhol was involved in, you know, this idea of, like you say, the spectacle. You join this community, you become integrated in this total immersive experience. Is this sort of like the Situationists International? Yes, yeah, it is. And they I think were more overtly political, or more like pre-punk, insofar as it was like an urban critique, an institutional critique, whereas in New York with the Dolls, it was much more of this just, you know, almost like the WeWork kind of cult of losing yourself in the culture, in the cults, in the group, you know, in the community. But this idea of the loss of self in spectacle, and this kind of notion of being enveloped by artwork, that artwork is not an object, but it's a theater, it's an experience, originated with the Gesamtkunstwerk and Wagner and opera and stuff at the beginning of the 20th century. So, you know, at the end of the 19th century even. But it really is now reaching its kind of like apex today. I mean, just during the pandemic, one of the larger galleries in the world created this outpost at which the only artworks that are featured are these types of immersive experiences. And everywhere you look, every museum in the United States has these shows now where you walk into Vincent van Gogh's, world, it's like everything has become this kind of Times Square, Disneyland thing spectacle that you enter into. Now, we were warned about this by a brilliant guy, Michael Fried, who was writing on minimal art in the 1970s, actually late 1960s. And he said, if art loses its identity as objecthood and it becomes theater, we've lost art. And it was like this clarion call that I guess no one heeded. But the whole idea of minimal art was basically taking art down to anything. It's so de-skilled. It's beyond like your Jackson Pollock kind of like throwing paint around that you don't even need paint for something to be art. You could just, identify something as art. And that, this is the whole ethos of Yoko Ono and the Fluxus movement, is that
Uh-oh. I felt like we were reaching an apex there. Let's give her 2 seconds.
But she got to the apex with Yoko Ono, so I think she.
I think so too. No, that was actually a very interesting little compositional riff that she threw out there, and I'm going to ask Adria if she could maybe write up a little essay or something.
I was going to say, I was going to put that down on paper. That's an interesting. There's a lot of interesting stuff there to ponder.
Yeah. Any based on what she threw out there, is there anything that you'd like to?
I'm actually not very familiar with most of the things that I just because I haven't explored those avenues as much, but I resonate with all the themes or like the intentions. And there's a lot of novelty. I see it as like, this is the fake idea of original, or there's often this fake idea of originality, which is like doing something that's never been done before. That's new and different, but that doesn't mean it's original. Right? If we're going from this, taking the standpoint of timelessness and timeless art, which is both there's the unchanging and eternal qualities of beauty, truth, and goodness that it somehow is tapping into, but it's also doing that from the standpoint of the changing, right? Plato's change and unchange, of that we live in a unique age, right? Every age is different. Every person is different. So they can't just be, it's like we are not just constantly creating icons, right? Like static Byzantine icons, because like that was the art of that. And if we're going back to more traditional values, we need to just start making a bunch of new icons. And like there's always a development aspect, but there's always that eternal, timeless, and unchanging. And the challenge is how to originally express that within our own unique age. And that's the real challenge. Because the truths are unchanging. Human nature is unchanging.
Amen.
I think the whole idea about having these visual exhibitions, like we had the Leonardo da Vinci one here, not Leonardo da Vinci, I'm sorry, the Picasso one here in Toronto, is first of all, it's all based on emotions, right? And it's all based on a new experience. That's how they put it. And you go there and you're overwhelmed by your senses are overload. And you come out of it, you haven't really learned anything. It's just that you're overwhelmed, your senses are overwhelmed, but there's nothing really that you could develop in yourself in terms of recognition of things.
It's pure novelty.
Yeah, and it's based on that too. Yeah, just go there because it's something new, right? You got to experience it, and it's just emotions, nothing else.
Yeah. It's like the
But
cult of
ori-
the interesting. Sorry, go on. Yeah, go for it.
but original. I think that the first meaning of original is from the source. Okay, from truth, goodness, beauty. So that, once again, I go back to the fact that there's nothing wrong if you have a playful attitude, an aristocratic attitude. If you see an original stuff in the meaning of new stuff, it's okay. But if you have the capacity to distinguish if it's from the source, it's only a composition. Is it dialectics or is it rhetoric? Okay, and because there's nothing wrong to be drowned in rhetorical things, as long as you know the original dialectics to go back to the source.
Yeah, it's like there's nothing wrong with the formula as long as you know the creative spirited thought process that created the discovery of which the formula is but a shadow. The formula is not something to be afraid of. It's a formula. It's useful and can be applied, but don't.
What it was created to be applied to, right?
Yeah.
If you start trying to apply something that worked in one situation to another, because you're not recognizing that it's a different case, then you have problems.
Right.
And that's knowledge versus imitation. Like, are you applying these models that you've developed based on your experience of certain scenarios, and then you believe that's the real thing, that's knowledge, that's universal, and then you're applying it to other cases and it doesn't work, and you start coming up, well, people do all sorts of things to justify that, right? Like whether it's crazy theories or everything is meaningless or who knows, right? But that's knowledge versus imitation versus the real thing. They're just models. We can't turn them into a dogma.
All right, so we have time for 3 more questions. So we're going to go in this order of Stephen, then Jerry, then Kelly. Stephen, then Kelly, then Jerry. So Stephen, I know you've been waiting for a while.
Quick.
Yeah.
Dave, thanks. And the question that your lecture provoked has to do with the neurolinguistic programming, the anchor concept and all that sort of stuff, which I can see being used both for ill or for good. Is there any evidence of these techniques in classical Greek mythology? And I'm just curious because that has been so influential throughout the great minds, in Western civilization. I'm just wondering if there is any evidence that exists within some of the myths, perhaps, and if so, could that have arisen naturally, or if not, should we draw some inferences from that? So I'm just curious as to, if you or anyone else has thought about that.
Well, I mean, anything can be an anchor. Like the example that I first saw on YouTube, like for example, if I say like that Richard Bandler gave, like these are just formalized things. Like anchors are anything, right? Plato was talking about, people would refer to like a passage from Homer, right? Like something that stuck out, and then people will recall this in different situations and deem that this is suitable to speak to the moment, right? So that those compelling scenes, or whether were anchored into their mind, right? It's not like there was anything nefarious done per se, but their imaginations were moved, and these scenes stayed with them, and then you can apply them in different scenarios, and you believe that you may or may not, they may be adequate or they might not. The one that I found interesting was I watched this documentary, and it was just they were talking about a rhetorician when the Macedonian Empire was trying to like make a comeback or something, fighting the Greeks at some point. I forget the name of the general, but anyways, he was a good speaker, rhetorician, and his army was losing, and he did something to completely change the whole game, or let the morale of the troops, which is key. And he said, you've beaten these people before, because they had fought these Greeks before and they had won. And so by saying that, it seems like a minor thing, but he's eliciting that feeling of victory that they had. And that obviously radically changes the morale, because now they're in that state. They can feel it, right? Just like and so they fought completely differently and they won the battle. So that's you know, you could say there's a reference point, and you're just getting people to recall that. It's can be a good thing, right? If people kind of go off the rails, they're like, hey, remember when, you know, like you weren't doing this before, like things were like that. Then people remember, hey, yeah, like, you know, it's just it can be useful as it happens naturally all the time, right? That's why it's the question of like formalizing these things and then trying to weaponize them.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just quick on the issue of the sacredness of history, I think the power of history in that sense is wonderful, because it gives you, when looked at from this principled top-down orientation, it gives you a better empowerment, because even though it's not commonly understood, because obviously there's been a lot of effort to scrub or create a collective amnesia, the reality is there are actually, within the continuity of the human experience, so many case studies and examples of this oligarchical, you know, force, which has not only self-sabotaged, destroyed itself, but also has been taken down by a higher, more potent quality of thinking and being and action throughout history. You know, it's not like today this whole agenda to consolidate power in the hands of a small elite is brand new. It's not like they've only just started. It's not only that they've just started to try to create a feudal technocracy now, and it's not like they've been trying to do this for 1,000 years, slowly waiting for thousands of years to strike now. They've tried to strike so many times when you actually look at history, and they've failed for a variety of very understandable reasons, which again is actually very empowering. And if you can, from somebody speaking and giving lessons of our history and the story of our history, if you can invoke these living memories from the subconscious where it currently exists back into the conscious where it should be, where people could take pride, these are like healthy anchors to both see that this beast is actually a lot less powerful than it wants us to believe it is. And we're much more powerful than we think we are from that standpoint. And these are like really, that's inversely, like, I suppose, a good form of anchor to see. Even this goes back to ancient times as well, right? How many times even the small forces of Greece were able to undo a much bigger force in Persia, or there's so many case studies. It has a lot to do with this question of identity, creativity, and your concept of what natural law is that you're participating in. And that identity question is just everything. So yeah, great contribution to that, Dave. Kelly, are you still there, Kelly?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Hey. Hi, Kelly.
Yeah, there's this conversation, we can go in so many directions. So I'm just looking at your title, From Trance to Transcendence. And then I asked myself, like, how do I know that I'm under a trance? Like, how do I know that? And you know, somebody can tell me, you know, oh, this is wrong, this is what's wrong, or whatever, or I could like try and think about it myself, like what's wrong with me, and then I can, you know, I can study, I can read books, and then I think about things like my ego, my mind, my soul, all kinds of stuff, and then, you know, and you think about it and you try and maybe analyze yourself, and you can get so frustrated, and but in the end, I think of stuff like, well, there's like all these things happening in my mind. Like I have like my spirit, my ego, my like my body, you know, and all these things are kind of communicating with me, and so it's like, well, another word comes to mind, balance. Like all these things have to balance each other out, and then maybe I might come to an answer if it could be balanced. And it's like, well, how do I balance? And I guess what it all comes down to, like for me, it's like I can only know so much. I can only, like, there's only so much I can know. It's just so much I can handle. And then whatever I can't handle, it's like, what do I do with that? So I end up thinking about like things like a higher power, a god, I don't know. Yeah, just something greater than me. And then, so like, when I'm in that kind of confusion, I just like leave it all up to that. And then that helps with this balance. And like, I guess I have to say it works, but you know, just by believing that, like, it's not me that's at the top, there's something greater than me. And then it helps me get answers that maybe I can't get from a book or you know, a video or something like that. I don't know.
I mean, I feel like you're pretty much showing that it works. Like you're saying that when you listen to that, right? When listen in a real, we're not just hearing words or hearing something, but we're actually paying attention and we're aware. I mean, I like the idea that the truth is simple. And oftentimes it's all the things that people do to kind of avoid the truth or try and like get their way in a certain situation. That complicates it. Like the truth is eternally simple. The truth is one. It's one thing. And yeah, I think that's often what's complicated, is that we're throwing in things to make it a certain way. But you're saying when you listen and you pay attention and you try and tap into that deeper something or that higher something, it tends to take care of things. And I think that's the real mystery. If we want
Well, yeah, I don't know how it works, but it helps if there's another way that's better. I'm all ears. But so far,
well, it's an art, right? I mean, it's a journey, but I think that's an intimation of there's something deeper inside us. And once we become aware of that, then there's a whole process of, okay, how do we stay in dialogue with that? How do we commune with that constantly, every day, and ultimately every moment, such that that's the thing that we become that thing. And I would just say, like, there's a very interesting, I have a great book, and it's a bunch of excerpts, different mystical thinkers, theologians, and like Saint Teresa of Avila. Long story short, she has the 4 degrees of prayer. And she just gives the metaphor of you're getting water to grow a garden. And you have different ways of getting the sacred water. You have the well, where you have to go all the way down with the bucket, and you have to strain a lot to get even just a bit. Then you have this, and that's the 1st degree of prayer. So it's like we have to be very aware, conscious, present in our moment. There's different ways to do it, right? Talk about meditation in the same way, where we're very much focused on that deeper quality that we're talking about, which we don't have to put a name on, just to say that there's something there. The second is she talks about the windlass, and you have like a gear. So you're bringing the water up from the well, and it's a lot easier. You can get a lot more water. You still got to focus. You still got to work. You know, just like if you meditate, you know, and you focus on your breathing for 20 minutes, there's different ways of doing that as well, like different kinds of breathing. You find yourself maybe getting lighter, or like you get a certain freedom, and you start. Keats famously said, "Heard melodies are sweet, those unheard are sweeter." Right? Is that silence really just silence? What happens when we go there? And so that's the 2nd degree of prayer. Then the 3rd degree is, she says, it's a stream. So instead you're getting the water directly from the stream, the soil around the stream is a bit more moist. So you have to water things less. And she says this is where you become able to be in that state while doing things. While doing acts of charity, while actually being active. You remain in that kind of transcendent state where you're in touch with that deeper thing. And it's a practice, right? And my thing is about, and so
it's a good start. It's a good start.
To fourth degree is, hang on a second here. 2 seconds. Are you still there?
Yeah, we're all still, yeah, your laptop didn't die yet.
There we go. Are you using my, which camera am I using? Am I using this camera?
Whatever one is on right now, we're not using, no. Pick the other one.
See something?
I said, pick the other camera. Your camera's off.
Yeah, let's do this. Just using my laptop camera.
Yeah, that works.
Sorry, switch. Fourth degree is, you're right, it's the rain. So the water comes, and she says, yeah, you have less and less control over it. Like, it doesn't come, it's like inspiration when we talk about the muses. You can't sit down and write a great poem, right? Or create a great piece of art. Great art has to find you, right? Great ideas find us. We don't just like, I'm gonna have a good idea now. That's not how it works. So there's a mystery, right? So people have all these like fetishy ideas of mystery and magic, but there is the fundamental basic mystery of humanity and of the universe, that there is this thing that we can tap into, this creative principle. And so there are all these things that we can do to pursue that, to the point where at the fourth stage, which that's how she describes it, we're just constantly there. That's just the domain that we inhabit. And it's easier and easier is the other thing that she says. Like, you don't want to leave that state of creative joy and, you know, divine love, where you really see that spark in everybody, whether they're aware of it or not. And that's really the thing that you become attuned to, right? You see human beings as really what they are. And that's where she, you know, this is agape. That's the fourth, that's the Greek word. The Greeks have 4 words for love. It's not eros, it's not storge, it's not familial love, which is storge, eros, sensual love and intimacy, or philios, which is brotherly love and friendship. Agape is not any of those. It's a divine love. And so there's ways of practices and things, and I think we could talk about that for a long time, like how to tap into that. But that's where real creative inspiration and the divine comes. And then we don't want to leave it, right? Because everything else seems less good than that. So that's like the ultimate food, you know, that's, you get this kind of language. Yeah, we stay hungry for that, and we're supposed to stay eternally hungry for that.
So I guess my question is, how do you know you're in a trance? How do you know you're being hosed? You know, like
it's that practice of tapping into that. I mean, no, I feel like it depends on the person, right? Like, situations are different. I feel like I'd be interested to hear what Kwan has to say about that as well, or others. But I mean, again, if we talk about the inner voice, and like if somebody's in a cult, they'll often, I was speaking with Mormons actually, and they told me they were listening, that I brought up the idea of the inner voice. It was a fun conversation. You know, they were nice. I like them. But that's the thing, right? So he's saying God gives him career options as well. You'll see people will start to go to town with that stuff. But I think it's about being true, right? There's a deeper reality that we have to tap into. That inner voice is pure awareness and consciousness. So our selective choosing of things, like there is a choice, right? People are making a choice when they choose to live a delusion. And sometimes they have the luxury of continuing to live it out, and they will, you know, bless them if they continue and have the ability to. But there are people who don't want to live illusions. And I think that's where we have to tap in. And our body will send us messages as well. You said that too. Like we'll get signs if we're living illusions, right? Like it's not like everything is perfect and there was no sign, right? People are like, I don't know what went wrong. Everything was perfect. And then everything just came apart. That's not what happens. You know, so honesty is honesty, right? That's, I feel like we can, that's what, it's simple. What's complicated is all the things that people will do to avoid that.
Yeah. So for me, that inner voice, it comes, like, I guess it comes from balancing out that ego part of you, the spiritual part, and that, I don't know, the soul part, I guess. And if they're all in some kind of balance, and then somehow that's how that inner voice, then it kind of, once it's in balance, it kind of comes out like in a whisper or something. And I don't know, that's kind of like my answer, whatever that whisper may be. But if you go out drinking, you know, at night, you wake up in the morning, you're not going to hear that whisper. You know, because it's somehow got out of balance.
It'll come back, right?
Yeah. But
Juan, did you want to chime in on a thought regarding this?
And I'm gonna have to get going.
Yeah. How about this? So how about this? What time do you have to end, Dave?
I kind of got to go now because I got to.
Oh, Jerry, I'm sorry, Jerry.
But no, okay, I got one more. Like,
okay, all right. So let's, Jerry. All right, you got one chance.
Okay, I'll try to be fast, Dave. Although, to be honest, I've got about 1 million questions for you. You just got my head spinning like a top. This was such a good lecture. But, well,
I mean, I'm just glad I could share my head spinning with you guys. I mean, my head is spinning too, right?
Oh, good. We're both spinning. But, well, even what Kelly was talking about, you know, how do we know if we're in a trance? And you were talking about it at the first, about how, you know, the media uses these images and felt thoughts to kind of manipulate us. And you use that example of how they show on TV, you know, pictures of children and poor women, and they're trying to evoke in us a sense of pity. And for me, I hate pity. I think pity is disgusting. Now, I just want to explain that before people get upset, because when I was doing some research on one of my books, and I'm looking into Ben Franklin when he's over in London, and he's involved with certain people who are part of the abolitionist movement. And it's a real untold story. But the story that we're fed is this guy Wilberforce was the great abolitionist in England. So I'm reading about this guy Wilberforce, and he founds this Society for Abolition of Slavery, so-called. And he used to have these meetings, you know, in halls and churches. And in the middle of the hall, running from the front of the hall to the back, would be a big curtain. On one side of the curtain is the white people. On the other side of the curtain is the black people, the former slaves. And he's supposed to be talking about abolition, but he's got the whole damn room segregated. So I'm going, what is wrong with this picture? And I think, Kelly, that's the point, is you get this, you know, contradiction. You get this thing that just does not make sense. And I'm wondering, how can this guy be the great abolitionist when he's a damn racist? He segregates his room. And then I'm reading more on this guy, and Wilberforce, the same guy who founds this abolition society, is also the founder of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, right? Pity. You have pity for hurt animals.
Right.
In the same way he has pity for former slaves. Well,
right.
These people don't want your pity. Someone who's handicapped or disadvantaged, they don't want your damn pity, right? It's like you were saying about the British elite, how they want to remove empathy from people as a way they keep power. I mean, what you want to evoke in people is not pity, but a sense of empathy or sympathy, or the idea of love, right? That you want to love your fellow man, not have pity for him. But I just wanted to give that example because it's, you've got to look for these contradictions. And then, I put this little quote in the chat. I think it's from Schiller, how we have to educate our emotions. But I think we all have it in us, and the more we listen to stuff like what you're talking about, Dave and Matt and Quan, we get an idea how to solve these contradictions. But, in a way we're looking for, as Quan keeps trying to educate us, goodness, beauty, and truth. But I just wanted to bring that out. And Dave, I want you can continue on that thought, please.
I will just say one example that really does come to mind, because we just talked about pity and empathy, and there are a lot of psyops that are about this fake empathy. The name of the operation is not coming to mind, but this was a big thing. It was on the Middle East Eye website that back in like 2000, I forget, where the British intelligence, there was word that it was during Theresa May when she was prime minister. They were really afraid of the mobs, right? Which is a thing that ultimately politicians are very much afraid of when the population gets angry. And it was because around all the terrorist bombings in England and London. And so they had something, it was called something operations, where they were trying to take all the rage that people had about all these terrorist incidents, which all sorts of sketchy things, right? Background in terms of how these things happen. But they had all the social media stuff ready for like the warm and loving, like work together, support, and like all the teddy bears on the bridges and all the nice stuff to make people feel warm, right? As a way of getting people to come together. And I mean, they did the same thing with 9/11, right? In terms of like, it was all we're together and da-da-da-da-da. But then what were these warm feelings used to do? Ultimately, right? You pacified people and then things took a different route. So it's very psyopy. So the false empathy or pity thing is actually a lot of the psyops today, right? They're around eliciting that in people to get them to at least not be aggressive, right? Like you want green trees and green grass and clean air, right? You're not against the environment. Like it's for everybody. Think about the next generations. Like you don't want all the untold death and suffering of children that haven't even been born yet, just because you wanted to, ride your SUV kind of thing. So a lot of it is framed on that today. So it's all the more, it's gross. It's like MI6, it's not normal agencies that are investing so much in that. I'll find the article. It was very fascinating. It was, the politicians were afraid, and so they found a way to take the rage and divert it away from, the public policies that were sort of just in place that allowed for all sorts of bad things to happen. I really do have to go.
I hear you, man. No, Dave, thank you very much for, this is a fun one. This is really good. I'm really happy that we did this. I'll just, I guess, end by just saying very quickly, anything that, obviously there's a lot of ideas that have been touched upon that haven't been developed. I'm going to ask Dave, if you can, in a few weeks time, maybe 4 or 5 weeks, would you be able to do this again?
Sure. Yeah.
All right, cool. And anybody who wants to follow through on Dave's work, the work he's doing, the Chained Muse, which also features works by Adam Sedia, Gerald, Quan, I think is published up there. That's thechainedmuse.com.
Substack.
And Substack. Dave,
my Substack is where I'm bringing everything increasingly the focus, and that's where the new articles are all dropping as well. So Age of Muses.
Okay.
David Gosselin on Substack. And new podcasts. The guest is yet to be determined, but the theme is already chosen: beauty, truth, and soma. And we'll be exploring this soma culture that we're in and what what that means, the learning to suppress the inner voice and have these external voices and the struggle between that. So that this is really what the Soma culture, that's what we're living in. That's what we're going to explore, that beauty, truth, and Soma.
Good. All right. Looking forward to it.
This was fun.
Yep. Thank
I'll
you,
talk
everyone.
to everybody soon.
Till next week.
Thank you. See
Bye-bye.
you everyone soon. Bye.